Bleem, your videographer from KNOM website. Welcome to the College of Complexes. Let us know if you'd like to see some more of these nice videos.
This is our 182nd meeting since we started 4 years ago. This actually started in Chicago in 1951 for the purpose of solving all the world's problems. We're still working at it. We meet every week. We have a speaker we put on. We give an hour to make a presentation. After that, we have questions and answers, not speeches. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter that we listen only one fool at a time. Can you hear me all right? All right, just checking. And one fool at a time, yes. Anyway, after that we allow our speaker to comment on the comments and close the meeting. So that's how it works. But before we introduce our speakers, this is the time we have for announcements. Are there any announcements? Everybody has a... George has an announcement, I know that. Somebody has an announcement. This is the time to make it. You get it out of your system and then you don't have to worry about it. It's done. So George has the first announcement. You're up. Make your announcement.
Yeah, since Susie isn't here tonight, I am looking for sponsorship for me for Relay for Life, which is next Saturday night. So anybody that wants to donate anything, I do have the proper stuff, and I even have an envelope to carry all the money in. So Relay for Life for the American Cancer Society. Thank you.
Okay, Joe has an announcement. Get up here and make it. Up here. Oh, I should test out these mics, you know. Make sure they...
On March 25th, 6 continents, 320 cities in the U.S., there's going to be a worldwide protest against Monsanto. And I don't have the details on it, but look for May 25th. Yeah, I think it's a Saturday. And, you know, Monsanto is not our friend. What? I don't have the details for Dallas City Hall. Hank says City Hall. But what I understand is 320 cities in the U.S. so far, and there's also a march and protest planned on everywhere but Antarctica.
Any other announcements? Now's the time. Any announcements? No? That's it for announcements? Well, next week we have personal autonomy, who owns me. That's Andy Manuel. She's president of PPALAG division. It's parents of, anyway, reproductive rights activists. We'll discuss some people, ownership society, in other words, her personal autonomy, who owns me. That's what she's going to talk about. That's next week. It's on your sheet there if you have it. I don't want to read all this. I'll put you to sleep. The following week, what do we have there? Wait. Oh, well. Romanian lady, Virginia Proden, if she answers, she may be our speaker on May 25th. It's hard to say. And then we have to decide, do you want to meet on May 25th? That's that should be Memorial Day weekend. So that's up to you. But anyway, I offer her the date of May 25th. I imagine some people will be here. So, well, our speaker tonight is David Wasserman. He's a political science, Bachelor of Arts Political Science from Tufts University. He's got an MA in Teaching Social Science. He's going to discuss how the loss of civilian life in Iraq and Afghanistan radicalizes Muslims. It presents a dire threat to Americans. Dave will provide statistics on civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are often classified and are rarely covered in American media. If you're interested in understanding why Islamic terrorists kill Americans, you should be interested in this presentation. Please bring a pen and pencil. We've also got them here. You'll be handed study materials, which you should have, and we'll give you a simple test. Anyway, the title of this is Our Foreign War on Terror Really a Source of Terrorism? So without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to David Wasserman.
How many of you would associate most of our military ventures in the Middle East, particularly the Iraq and Iran wars, with kind of a, already existing, gosh, never mind, forget that. I'm not doing good today. Thank you. I'll sit down now. Gosh. The gist of what I'm going to talk about tonight is our wars, our three wars that I'm going to specify with the original war, which was the Russian war with Afghanistan, which started around 1979, December. It was shortly after the Iranian hostage crisis, which is important in terms of the Iranian hostage crisis representing the first attempt by one of the Middle Eastern countries that we had interest in because of their oil deposits to have a Iranian state. The interesting thing, and there's a lot of them interesting about the Iranian revolution, religious revolution, was that the former prime minister, Mohammed, what's his last name? Mohammadi, was an elected democratic, Mossadegh, thank you. My mind's gone today, was elected, and that, 50 years after this occurred, which was around, it was 1952, in addition to being democratically elected, there was a CIA coup that removed him from office, and there was sort of a collective memory of a lot of the Iranian students that attacked or that entered the Iranian embassy in Tehran that day, that sort of an enmity, first of all, for the removing of that regime and the concept, the awareness that the members of the State Department were responsible for that coup, and also for the, of course, the placement of the Shah. And one of the big problems that hopefully collectively the Western countries that wanted to occupy those countries in the Middle East should have learned from that is that the suppression, I think, of Islam, at some point there's frequently a backlash, particularly at that point when there was a revolution that was primarily based on a return to Shia, which is Islam law. After that event, after 1979, right in December of 1979, while the Ayatollah Khomeini was in power and ascending to more power, and he was a pretty ruthless leader, we wrote, Carter, largely in response to, of course, the Soviets working to Kabul in Afghanistan, in a move that was pretty much planned by the CIA, the Russian CIA, KGB, I'm sorry. Oh gosh, this is going bad. The U.S. response was, from its origin, from its beginnings, was something that was part of U.S. doctrine in the Carter administration. And I was going to read the language of the Carter doctrine just briefly, how it set up what was called the Central Command. The Central Command was all the countries, including the United States, that were tasked and organized by Carter to respond to threats to those countries that had oil or that were close to the Persian Gulf. And Afghanistan was considered close enough. Geographically, if you look at your map, you see Afghanistan and then the Russian countries to the north. The problem with the, in terms of a political and strategic objective, was that a flow into Afghanistan would give, once the Russians got to Kabul, they could push through to Iran, which was a country that, at that time, well, I mean, it was known, and there were already a lot of Western countries, particularly Britain, that had already fought wars with Iran between World War I and World War II for their oil. Britain needing to obtain oil, probably worse than the United States, having no real deposits. So there were other Western countries, and there were really a number of Western countries that gave arms. Most of them, in some ways covertly. All of the U.S. support was under Carter and was completely covertly through the CIA. Most people know this, but what's interesting is the number of countries that actually provided support. And I'm going to turn to my early notes. If you go through this, you'll pass the little quiz. It should start with brief history, the brief history of the alliances in the Russian-Afghani War on page 8. By July 3rd of 1979, Carter had already signed the directive to give financial aid. And of course, when you do a covert war, you do have to present to certain houses of Congress. You don't have to go through all acts of Congress, and you don't need to get, of course, much consent of the American populace to vote on a resolution or to really even gain support for the candidate or the executive that's organizing the war. After 1917, Russia, much like the United States, I think, with a lot of countries that they've tried to give support, we're actually giving arms, money to hospitals, universities, buildings, power plants, schools, perceived at this point by the Afghans as fairly good allies. In exchange, probably for their aid and military aid, military aid as well. They're basically placing a communist rule, and we're trying to build a Afghani army that was pro-Soviet. That presented the bulk. I mean, there was both political objectives, and there was also, but probably more importantly, the whole region, all the way back to Roosevelt, was perceived as critical and crucial for the need for the United States to have a direct and continued flow of oil, not just for itself, but for its allies. Now, in World War II, which a lot of people don't consider, and it's important, in World War II, the U.S. actually was providing oil from their own supplies to most of the Allied countries, particularly Great Britain and a lot of Western Europe. So the concept of the U.S. supplying oil was always to itself and to its Western allies, largely because most of these countries during the time needed to survive. They needed it for their weaponry, they needed, and there was huge amounts of oil used, like on D-Day. At the time, the U.S. had sufficient reserves and sufficient wells drilled to do most of that. There was also the perception that after the war, we would need additional supplies, and Roosevelt realized this pretty early on, that in order to have a free Europe, that they needed to eventually rebuild. They needed fuel, and they needed power to do that, particularly Great Britain, who, although it obtained a lot of the supplies from the Middle East prior to World War II, was somewhat decimated and needed to rebuild. So there was a huge amount of oil as part of the Marshall Plan that had to be supplied to a lot of the countries in Western Europe. That's why the perception by the United States is that probably the demand that in order to have a free America, to have an effective U.S. economy, there had to be enough energy supplied to our Western allies, particularly Western Europe. The only other country at that time that had refined and processed and produced a significant amount of oil was Russia. Now, it's interesting that Russia and the United States were, in terms of financing the Afghani war, the Afghani-Soviet War were the two main adversaries in terms of supplying arms, supplying money to each side. And the war was perceived at the time as, of course, a Cold War, but the importance of its strategic placement, both in the Carter Doctrine, in terms of its being a threat to adjacent countries that contain, that were near the Persian Gulf, particularly Iran and, potentially Iraq, the ability to actually tap into the area at the northernmost part of the Gulf was considered a problem. Roosevelt, prior to this, and this is really important, Roosevelt, when he went into Saudi Arabia, the basic perception of Roosevelt is that our own oil supplies were diminishing, or at least being tapped at a range, and since we were looking to supply such a large part of the world after World War II, Roosevelt realized there was a need to find a country with larger oil resources. By that time, the oil companies in the U.S. were already multinational, in many respects, at least going into a lot of the North American continents and countries trying to do additional drilling. And at that time, basically the deal we made with Saudi Arabia, we were wise enough and lucky enough at that time not really to want to affect their style of government or the fact that they were an Islamic state. We talked to Ibn Saud and said, okay, we'll supply you funding to increase your oil output. We'll put in the wells. We'll provide you military protection. We'll send in troops as part of a consistent policy. This is going to be stated as part of the Roosevelt Doctrine, and Saudi Arabia became probably from that point on one of the largest producers in the Gulf area, and it pretty much always was a home to, although a lot of other international companies, the U.S. had Saudi Arabia pretty much from that point on. It wasn't primarily used, although Great Britain had a presence there. That pretty much ensured, again, really to our allies and also to most of the multinationals at that point, which all were outgrowths of Standard Oil from the late 1800s. Now, the basic insurrection that occurred in Afghanistan during that war what probably led to the war more than anything else, was when the Soviet Union used Marxist philosophy to say, well, we want to modernize Afghanistan, and that's not really going to go unless we use some of the basic Marxist principles. So they tried to collectivize and break up a lot of the landowners. What they did when there was already Islamic groups within the country that were resisting communism and resisting particularly that particular edict, to break up a lot of the farms of the wealthier farmers. And what this led to, because of counter-resistance and counter-moves, or before the real incursion of the Soviets, there was imprisonment of a lot of the country imams, the religious leaders, and a lot of Islamic leaders that were resisting. Also the fact that Russia was trying to change marriage laws because they thought they were not modern. A couple other things that were, I think also the mode of dress, things that really Russia could have learned from what was happening in Iran prior, or just a few months before. Really, the reasons that the Shah of Iran had been deposed. But at that time, they really didn't learn from that lesson. What they did was really ultimately, there were 27,000 imprisoned Islams that were part of protest groups, mostly for religious reasons, that were first imprisoned, and a lot of them were put to death. That pretty much that solidified a lot of the Afghanis, gave them more of the need and the desire to resist, and then the U.S. put more and more wealth and troops. Now, a lot of the, not troops, but financial support. One of the motives for the U.S. and for the CIA, anyway, that basically expanded the war. And really what I wanted to deal with were This went, of course, from the Carter and into the Reagan administration. There was, I guess, a slow period of withdrawal. If you look at page 9, there were 34 Islamic nations that signed a resolution condemning the Soviet intervention. Just to say that, in a sense, this was a wide regional war of Islamic countries opposed to, in this case, Soviet intervention of the country, because, among other things, Soviets were suppressing Islam as part of the concept that they could modernize the country. But in doing so, they were suppressing Islam, and that was a lesson that I think the U.S. took somewhat in their invasion later of Iraq, in the 90s. But I don't think they took it enough to heart. And I think communism is more naturally anti-religion of all forms. I think the adherence of the Islamic population to the religion is something that's probably is much stronger than I think the Western countries seem to realize, and that was a sticky point really for most of the Western countries that waged war. In the countries, I think, where there was less suppression of Islam, there was sometimes more success. I don't think we really tried to suppress many of the cultures or ways of the Saudi family. They were willing, of course, to take military protection and subsidization of their oil industry. We weren't looking to really change Islam al-Qaeda there. And Saudi Arabia, then as in today, was no way a democratic country, no way was their freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and but of course they did get wealthy. A lot of that wealth did even trickle down. I don't think Saudis would really trade their association with the United States. Now, they still really they still have no great love of the West or Western religions or Western culture. They still really basically don't treat women the way that we would say women should be treated in the United States in terms of I guess their place in society predominantly. There's really still a lot of problems with that, and really most of our efforts to change that have been met with a lot of resistance. Just having women in the workplace is still something that's problematic. When we went in to Saudi Arabia, we originally in the first war with Iraq, actually the Persian Gulf War, we had to put troops, initially we had to put them somewhere, so we tried putting them in Saudi Arabia. We had Jewish troops there that really made a lot of the Saudi family and the Saudi rule pretty uncomfortable. If they weren't allowed to practice the religion within the Saudi confines, even though they were there to basically save Saudi Arabia from the advancing armies of Saddam Hussein, who were on their borders. So, I mean, their religion is something they're not going to change. It's not something they're ever going to adapt, and that's part of really a lot of the resentment of, in terms of how much they hate the West, it's been learned by Russian suppression of their religion. It's been learned by their hatred of the U.S. for basically deposing their leaders. And also, I think because they vary greatly in terms of their, how extreme they get in terms of their hatred of the West. There's certainly more than a few bands that are willing to wage war on the United States. There's more than one form of jihadist in Syria as well now, and there's supposed to be 30 factions in Syria. They're basically, in my opinion, without knowing, being a great expert on this, more than the majority of them want Islamic rule. More of the majority of them think that we're there largely to extract natural resources, which, if you look at American doctrine in the Middle East, from Roosevelt on, that's not entirely untrue. In fact, there's a lot of support for that view. Now, it's probably a faction that are the most militant, but there's the problem with all these wars, particularly the first war with Afghanistan. If you look on, I guess the only other thing I wanted to say on page 10, what Gorbachev did, which was really important, and what we basically accomplished from the war is that, of course, the spending by the Soviets eventually led, and really a lot of people didn't realize it, but the Soviet budget was already getting overdrawn because of their military. It was, at that time, about 1/10 the size of the U.S., and yet, of that, it's almost like their military budget was a huge percentage. It's 10% of ours in the United States. It was getting to be a much larger percentage of their budget. They really couldn't afford a 10-year war. They didn't anticipate a 10-year war. It's interesting because we've had a 10-year war with Iraq, and if you count the war in Afghanistan, we're really getting out more so than anything else because of the cost. And where else was going to go? On page 11, the worst part of that war, of course, was that when Reagan was supplying what was called the Afghani resistance, which of course became Osama bin Laden and eventually Al-Qaeda. It's had 3 names, but at that time it was the Afghani resistance. We sent into civilian deaths, there's a really wide range. You know, some said they're as high as 1 million, some said there's 700,000. That's pretty outrageous. That's about 70,000 a year. You know, whether that was inevitable in any sense of the word, or whether this was more a war against communism or war against the Soviet Union threatening gaining territory in the near the Gulf, you know, I would say it was both. And the Carter doctrine didn't really state as much about communism as it did about incursion into the area of the Gulf. So we have a huge civilian death, but what's probably most amazing, and this may be high, I think the figure that I read most frequently was 4 million were the total refugees, and most of them fled. If you look on your map, they could go either to Pakistan, they could go to Iran. You notice, you see the red borders there now. Of course, we don't want them going into either of those countries. But that's why we had, of course, such large populations in those 2 countries. And there was the bond of Islam. And these were basically people nowhere else to go. They couldn't go north because the Soviet, you know, they couldn't go back into the Soviet Union. The majority of them went either to Iran or Pakistan. And those groups largely, and of course the actual troops, and of course they remained there, you know, to a different extent. We found Osama bin Laden, you know, after near the end of the Iraqi war in Pakistan. So these 2 countries accepted and were really, geography at least, was pretty amenable to those troops. Oh, they weren't troops, they were really just homeless people. The number, I mean, some have estimated that 1/3 of the former Afghan population became refugees. Not all of them left the country, but the death and destruction of the country itself was pretty amazing. And I think I don't have a quote from Reagan about being inspired by the freedom fighters, which later became, of course, Al-Qaeda. Another strange deal that Reagan did in terms of not recognizing sort of the problem of terrorism, the arms for hostages deal, where he's basically giving money to what became the Hezbollah in Iran in order to free the hostages. And he gave arms, and that also was related to the Contras, which I don't even understand the association. So he basically funded and gave arms to 2 terrorist groups. Interesting thing about Reagan is most of the things that he did that were the worst either never came to light in time or were never really interpreted. Since people were so happy about the economy, it was kind of glossed over. And actually, the fact that the hostages were released was more positive to his administration than the methods by which he used to release them, which Carter, I guess, never came up with. If we thought about that today and thought about, you know, gaffes in a political administration that would be potential for impeachment or at least hearings, you know, that would maybe fit in somewhere in there, the arms for hostages. But I don't know, we've had a lot of political administrations that haven't really been called to task for some of the things they've done, particularly, I guess, in wartime. Let's see. Iraqi-Persian Gulf War was in many ways such a smashing success militarily. The problem by 1990, and this is probably the key point of my little talk, is that around 1970, Saddam Hussein, in addition to being, an unpleasant ruler, although he'd already been in power 20 years by this time, he'd already done things to the Kurds. The Kurds were really, there was no government there that hadn't suppressed the Kurds, including the Iranian government that had, under the Shah, had slaughtered Kurds. We looked the other way when the Shah slaughtered Kurds. I don't know if he used poison gas or not, but the Kurds have been slaughtered by both countries. We looked the other way when Saddam initially slaughtered the Kurds, and there's theories, pretty good theories, that was during the Iraqi-Iranian war in the 80s primarily. That was a war beyond bloody. And the first war was incredibly bloody because you've got, the first war with Afghanistan and Russia, you've got, this, like I said, you've got the CIA in Russia. You've got really the equivalent of a CIA force on steroids with the Afghani resistance fighters, which became Al-Qaeda. I mean, they did poisonings, assassinations of citizens, a lot of assassinations of just political leaders that were Soviet. And that group, I think because they found they were consolidated during that war, they were given a serious hatred of the Russians, and they had a hatred of both Russia's and the United States, sort of from the Iraqi Revolution, which targeted both the United States for being capitalist and of course non-Muslim, and Russia for being communist, which was anti-Muslim, really anti-religion. That attitude, especially the desire for an Islamic state and the antipathy towards both countries, really the incredible hatred, because they were funding both sides. I don't think it was something completely anticipated. Certainly we didn't anticipate 9/11. What Osama bin Laden said, his reason for 9/11 was revenge on the United States for being in Saudi Arabia, the land of Mecca, and what he considered holy ground for Islam. So he saw it. He really always saw, and many groups in Afghanistan and also Iraq saw that our war was a war against Islam. When we originally went in the 1990s, when you see a reign of terror, you see bombs falling. They don't read our media. They don't, they read Al Jazeera, if they read. And they do actually have a high rate of literacy, which I thought was interesting. Because of the incredible loss of civilian life in the first war, I think it was more of a reaffirmation of the refugees on the borders and what was left of Al-Qaeda to eventually organize after we'd won, which was 10 years ago, and of course May of 2003. Whoops, that was the second war. Let's get through this one. The Iraqi losses in the U.S.-Persian Gulf War, the original part of this was to shield. Well, it was originally called Desert Shield and then Desert Storm. Desert Storm was interesting because it was strictly the intent to shield our ally, Saudi Arabia, and to protect them from Saddam's advancing forces, to protect Kuwait. There were small civilian losses in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait. But basically, what a lot of the neoconservatives said, who kind of had a lot of input into this war, was that, yes, we made a mistake, yes, we got, among other things, poor intelligence. They admitted pretty much everything to what the Democrats had said about the invasion. That there was questionable, of course, even considered maybe by some treasonous, what they said about Yellow Cake, which was advanced by, of course, Condoleezza Rice, who actually, his prior job right before, of course she'd worked as a professor at Stanford and she was considered an authority on Soviet relations, but she'd worked as a public relations manager, chair for Chevron. And Chevron at the time had done a lot of things both in the United States and internationally, which were considered morally pretty reprehensible. In Nigeria, there had been killing of some native tribesmen who were eventually hung. This was because perhaps that the Nigerian army, they were saying this was really more the Nigerian army and not the troops that Chevron had organized to sort of go in and begin drilling. But that's what really happened ultimately. There was no decision that particularly said that the massacre didn't occur. What they said was, you know, this is international law. The Supreme Court doesn't have jurisdiction. So the case was dismissed against Chevron. Just like years and years and decades of antitrust laws that eventually failed, even though a lot of the U.S. presidents, like Roosevelt, even in Great Britain, Churchill tried to nationalize the oil industry to improve to allow competition, to keep them from bribing directly or indirectly national leaders and senators, and in the case of Churchill, of course, Parliament. That didn't work. Roosevelt even tried to do that at one point. It just never went anywhere. Every president from Taft on tried to break up Standard Oil, basically because what was popular at that date and no longer is a way, at that point, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and a lot of U.S. leaders felt that the oil consortium was basically anti-democratic. Nowadays, it's considered both democratic and that basically enterprise is the gist and the heart of democracy. But basically oil is, they're all basically, most of these countries are conglomerates that evolved from Standard Oil. And all of them have been tried repeatedly for violating trust laws. A lot of the trust laws, particularly the Sherman Antitrust Act under Taft, were aimed largely at Standard Oil. And the problem, of course, of monopoly in the oil industry has been an issue continuously. What Roosevelt said, Theodore Roosevelt, basically is that, you know, the corruption of the oil industry is something we can't really effectively combat, that we can't rule without oil, and we can't really effectively rule democratically with oil, since the oil conglomerates, because of their vast wealth, which was usually concentrated and applied very effectively in campaigns, or at that point, I mean, they outright would buy senators occasionally. That problem evolved. I mean, now the conditions of oil workers are pretty good. What I don't understand really is the expectation that in the industry that is always so concentrated wealth, why it would be, or will have the need or the desire to distribute wealth in underdeveloped countries when they don't, when we have a really major problem with that particular industry distributing wealth in this country. I mean, most of the companies don't want to be taxed, they don't want to share their wealth, and the concentration of wealth is really kind of the gist of a lot of the oil industry, as opposed to a lot of other industries. Now, there is a certain trickling down of wealth, and there's a certain essential need for oil in the United States, without a doubt. This region, having, you know, a great number of defense companies, GD and Raytheon, and just locally important ones, also several aeronautic companies that profit from war. We also have, of course, one of the largest concentration of oil companies and oil supply companies in this area. So you're not going to read about anything that's specifically anti-oil. You're not going to read even about statistics, probably in any newspaper, about the casualties of any of these three wars. Let me see, I'll talk a little bit more about the approximate number of Iraqis killed in the first Persian Gulf War, which included first defending Saudi Arabia, and secondly, well, basically pushing, like we all know this, pushing Saddam back to Baghdad. The civilian count, but this was like in 1 month, 2,000 to 4,000 approximately, and that's just civilian. The reason I really talk about civilians is because you could consider civilian life as innocent life to a certain extent, especially in these countries. Obviously they didn't want the US there, they didn't want Al-Qaeda there, they didn't want the Taliban there, and they didn't particularly have any control in any sense of having Saddam there. There was certainly, I think, a statistic that Jim Peeler reminded me of and wanted me to come up with. Of course, once the insurgency came in and there was the Al-Qaeda came in and started killing civilians, it was difficult to approximate what percentage of civilians they were killing. It's pretty substantial. I've seen 40%, particularly in the first war where it was mostly bombing and there wasn't really a wide insurgency. A lot of the civilian deaths were caused by our own bombs or by hand-to-hand fighting, but that war, or really, of course, by military confrontation, and there was mostly troops involved. We anticipated, even in that war, well, mostly the second war with Iraq, that the Iraqi army under Saddam would fold a little more quickly. But we were so really satisfied with the results of that war and the fact that there weren't that many U.S. dead, although there was substantial Iraqi dead, both civilian and non-civilian, that I think we were probably overpsyched to go back in and do that again. We also had the same, of course, the same basic advisors, and we had Cheney from the first administration. Let's see if there's anything else important here. DePonte, I think she was talking about both Iraqi wars, came up with a figure of, it's a totally different figure, about 100,000 civilian alone. I think that's probably a little large. I tried to also talk about the predictions of Iraqi civilian dead that came out of two groups. One, the United Nations tried to keep figures of these, and if you look on the first page, there's something called www.iraqbodycount.org. That includes, they do a pretty good job of breaking down civilian death, deaths in the original, just deaths by our military, deaths, short-term deaths, long-term deaths, deaths by Al-Qaeda. The greatest problem that we had, and that even the Soviets had in the Afghan-Russian war, we didn't anticipate the length of the war. That's probably the most critical mistake and the greatest surprise. Because we somehow created an insurgency in the country of Iraq that wasn't there prior to our invasion, we spent 5 times what we had intended to spend. We ended up with probably 5 times the loss of civilian life. We could have gotten out at that point, at any of those points, but we felt, the problem is we were really battling a problem that to some extent we'd caused, and there was even a little bit of classified information that came out of the Bush administration that this war was failing because of the size of the insurgency that we didn't anticipate or plan for, financially anyway. And it was the same insurgency that was basically, in terms of their motivation, the fact that they were unified by the Afghani-Russian war, it was pretty much the same insurgency, and it came from the 2 surrounding countries that we pushed the refugees out from the Russian and Afghani war originally. They came in from Iran and Pakistan, where of course we didn't have closed borders. There were a lot of problems, of course, in terms of long-term planning. In the Iraqi Freedom War, which was 2001 to present, the Iraqi Body Count Project put the civilian dead as high as 100,000. That may be a little higher than some other estimates. If you look at Wiki, just regular Wiki, and not WikiLeaks, they looked at 60,000 civilians, 100,000 Iraqis killed. The Iraqi body count came up with about 37% of the civilians killed were killed by U.S. troops. You might look at that as 40 or 50 or even, I'm sorry, you might look at that as lower, depending on how you want to interpret the data. Significant amount were killed by U.S. troops. A huge amount were also, of course, killed by Al-Qaeda. But the existence of Al-Qaeda, I mean, there wasn't this insurgency under Saddam. Saddam was a pretty cruel ruler. There wasn't much insurgency of any kind. How these groups were mobilized that quickly was probably a surprise to us. We didn't seal the borders. We didn't guard our munitions. And what we did guard immediately were the areas of the country that had oil. And we're still guarding those very carefully. Now, I don't know, I was going to talk about Karl Rove, but let me talk about things that are a little more important and get through that. This book. The current distribution of oil around 2010, near the end of the war and near the about the time we started withdrawing troops, we enacted a series of laws. Let's look at that first. Under economic reform of Iraq, this is one website I think you might want to look at, and I'll give you one more if you ever want to go home and look at something interesting. We pushed through a series of laws, actually, that modified the very constitution of a democratic country, which is questionable in a sense because although we didn't really violate international law, what we did is we took an occupied country and changed their constitution, basically because we went in largely, primarily because they had nationalized their oil wells. That's pretty much why we went into Iran the first time, to put in the Shah. We'd also gone into Cuba because of nationalization. It's not an oil country. And most of these had all been planned initially by the CIA. The other country we went into that also had CIA interference around this time in the 70s was Chile. And there were other countries I would assume that this happened to. So this wasn't something unique. And it was something very, of course, every time we did it, it was usually classified. The Chile incident came out in the New York Times, and they came out pretty quickly. But we were only giving money, and basically I think we were, I don't know, giving money to strikes against the Allende regime. It was just trying to establish a pattern there. Let's look at the laws a little bit, because it's pretty interesting. In June 2008, the Iraqi oil ministry announced plans to go ahead with, this one, economic reform of Iraq, if you have that one. Let's see where this starts. The first one, the first paragraph, Order 39, it laid out the framework for full privatization in Iraq from nationalization of the oil industry. That alone is a huge change. That was maybe what we were looking for in the beginning, except for what we consider primary extraction and initial processing of oil. Permitted, and this is important, 100% foreign ownership of Iraqi assets. That isn't really accurate. I mean, what happened in the end, but at least for a short period of time. The Iraqi oil law is a proposed piece of legislation submitted to what was called the Iraqi Council of Representatives. The provisional government, which was called the Coalition Provisional Authority, was the government at the time when this was drafted. Oh, damn. So let's see where this goes. Okay. Under taxation, Order 49, after Order 39, provided a tax cut for corporations operating within Iraq. One of the things that Iraq had used in addition to the nationalization of their oil system, which had plunged oil production in Iraq. And again, what we're always trying to do in these countries is, I mean, we don't mind buying oil, we don't mind a slow flow of oil. We don't want this flow of oil pretty much cut. That makes it hard for us, because we're not cutting our consumption. We haven't effectively done that. Definitely not under any regime, any of the previous administrations. So it cut the rate, which was at one time was a maximum of 40% to a maximum of 15%. And corporations that were working with the CPA, and I'm not sure which ones those are, were exempt from owing any tax. So taxes and tariffs were what made it expensive to operate in Iraq during nationalization and even prior to this edict. Let's see, Iraq, that all foreign oil companies, if you look at the next page, where it says CP Order 17, all foreign contractors operating in Iraq would have complete immunity from a legal process, effectively granting immunity from any kind of suit, civil or criminal, for actions the contractors engaged in within Iraq, and that covered a lot of the drilling companies, and it would cover a lot of the oil processes. CPA Order 12 under tariffs suspended all tariffs, removing the advantage that domestic Iraqi producers had over foreign producers. A 5% reconstruction levy, however, was levied on imported goods. So what happened around 2009 and 2010, shortly after this, is it was open bidding. There had already been bidding for the companies that supplied equipment. Let's talk about that first. This has a really major effect on the Texas economy. The four companies that were chosen were Halliburton, as you might suspect, and Halliburton has bases, of course, in Houston. They also have a base in Dubai. Halliburton has a long history here, and of course, Cheney was one of the CEOs. Weatherford International, which sounds like Weatherford, right? Well, it did start in Weatherford. It now has offices also in Dubai, but also large offices in Houston. The third company was, if you can write this down or not, or just think about it, was Baker Hughes, which also has offices in Houston. These are all multinationals. These generally have a presence in 80 to 100 different countries. These are, I mean, all these companies we're talking about and we'll be talking about are huge, huge multinationals, and have been multinational for quite a bit of time. But Baker Hughes got a lot of the contracts for Lukoil. Lukoil is the Russian oil company that has, and I'll get to that in a minute, it's kind of interesting to see what the outcome was of our association with Iraq. They have approximately, Lukoil has the largest single area of the oil wells. It's in, I'm trying to think, I'll get to that in a second where it is. Schlumberger, which was originally a French company, but has offices also in Houston, and is also largely a multinational with a lot of production in the United States, was the other company that was involved. So these are all pretty reasonable boons. These are huge companies with very large number of employees. They're all profiting and have been profiting early on. The U.S. won contracts for all the drilling sites, and there's going to be a lot of new wells drilled. The reason they were probably awarded, well, there were a lot of reasons, but one of them, they needed more efficient drilling. What they've already done since 2010, and prior to around 2010, in very short time, production and output of millions of barrels per day, it already equals and slightly exceeds what it was before the war. There had been downturns in the production in Iraq prior to that. Now, what Iraq is noted for, what's most important is, other than Saudi Arabia, they don't have the most production yet. They're about at what they were pre-war and a little bit higher, but they have more untapped reserves, undrilled areas with very rich deposits, very close to the surface, with heavier crude that requires significantly less cost to do the drilling, and can reap much larger number of millions of barrels per day, per year, whatever. I don't know how that's extracted exactly. What the figure is, well, let's get really to, and this is probably the most important point I'm going to make, the outcome of the bidding. Who owns what and where it is. There's a drill. One of the largest sites, probably the largest site, is in West Kurna, if you ever want to look on a map of Iraq. Now, all of this information, where'd it go? I'm trying to think. It's called just Economy of Iraq. I think the other one was under Economic Reform of Iraq. If you want to, this is the one, there's a single website you want to access, I keep saying this, but if you look up Economy of Iraq, you'll get this information. The West Kurna oil field went to Lukoil, which is Russian. The interesting thing about that is that Russia, prior to all of this, that Russia, first of all, was probably most evolved economically, of course, in Afghanistan. Russia's been interested in the region and really in oil deposits all over the world. But Russia not only gotten the largest oil field with the largest potential return, they were given a 75% stake. That means they can get the oil or the profits from 75% of the drilling. Now, Iraq gets 25% of all the drilling of every company there. That's more than enough to hopefully, probably improve the economy within maybe, or at least hopefully rebuild And the U.S. is also giving billions to help rebuild Iraq. That within maybe 10 to 15 years, the standard living might, I think they said there would be enough, if the drilling succeeded to the rate that they'd hoped, to have about $10,000 per capita per Iraqi citizen. And that's in the future. And there's a lot of things depending on whether or not there's that degree of success. But one of the figures given, production of oil in Saudi Arabia is kind of a constant. It's very significant, but it's not growing particularly. Whether or not it's going to, we could make it grow or it's going to grow, I don't know. But the potential for profit coming out of Iraq, I don't know, this sounds hard to believe, but what Iraq has said, and of course they're probably exaggerating, but they've said there could be profits by 2017. They could quadruple, or even say, they said they could have 6 times the amount of production currently in terms of millions of barrels per day, from 2.5 to 12 million. That's probably exaggerated, but let's just say they anticipated a growth of 4 to 5 times. That would still be phenomenal. The second country, and this is very important, in Rumalia, British Petroleum, which is considered part of the United Kingdom, it's not owned by the United Kingdom. British Petroleum produces more oil and gas in the United States than any other company. Exxon right now is largely international. A lot of the oil that they get is from their drilling in the other 102 countries they drill in. But if you look at Rumalia, and this is also in the southern part of Iraq, BP has an important history. A lot of these countries, and BP is one of them, has a huge presence in the United States. A lot of their drilling is done in Alaska. What's interesting about BP is they're as closely tied to the other Western oil countries, particularly the U.S. ones, and not exclusively the U.S. ones, that what the resulting outcome and what these companies are hoping and what really all these oil, and there's a cartel of oil companies. BP, except for having the name BP, is considered one of the 7 sisters. It evolved from a lot of U.S. companies. It got the name BP. I think one of the interests was Iranian or was Middle Eastern. That doesn't make sense. One of the owners was British Petroleum, and it's a multinational with a huge presence in the United States. It does have offices in London, and I think it's offices in one other European country. So they have a 40% stake, and they have also a pretty good size deposit. There's actually more than one. I think there's actually just one large, what they call them super somethings. I don't know. It's what they call the deposits in this part of the country in Iraq. The 2 probably most significant sites, West Kurna 1 and West Kurna 2, you'll see those in the south of Iraq, near, what country? Look on your map. Near Kuwait is where a lot of them are, Rumalia and West Kurna. Now, West Kurna is where Exxon, and Exxon has probably the second largest portion of the country. And most of these are wealthy enough that there could be additional oils drilled, additional significantly more wells drilled. And anytime wells are drilled, they're usually, most of them are American companies predominantly, the 4 that I gave. There's also a Shell oil. Now Shell, Exxon, and British Petroleum, although they don't all, except for Exxon, they don't necessarily have their headquarters in the U.S., and this is Dutch Shell. Shell also operates enormously in the United States. Profits from Shell affect profits from their American subsidiaries. And what's more important, and something that was described really well in this book, which I think was the best reading, and I think someone's already used the tyranny of oil. It's a writer who writes for, I don't know, a lot of her, she writes for CNN website a lot. You see her articles. Her name is Antonia Juhas, which she came out with, which was interesting, writing about this. Where was I? That all of these companies, particularly parts of U.S., initially they were U.S. multinationals. So what they can do, I mean, what they're hoping is there won't be the possibility of OPEC restricting the flow of oil or setting prices. The whole desire really from this, from a Western perspective, and I'm thinking of Western perspective, not just the U.S., because this oil isn't oil that comes to the U.S. We have, we get most of our oil from Canada, Mexico, and a couple other South American countries that we don't supply ourselves, which is about 40%. What the hope is that instead of having OPEC set prices, that there'll be a stronger ability to set prices, but more importantly, there won't be oil embargoes that will be as effective against the United States should the governments and countries of the Gulf states, or what was called OPEC, decide to turn off the oil. Basically, just we'll have a little bit more control. And what probably is more interesting and probably a little more threatening is the profits that come in from these oils, particularly to Shell, which has a really good presence there, Exxon, and British Petroleum. All these companies also give money really to many countries, campaigns. They give lobby money. But what they do, which I think is really interesting and probably not a lot of people are aware of, all the think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, they have members on the board that are Shell Oil and British Petroleum executives, and some of them are Exxon executives. So the policies and the candidates that come out of those, the neoconservatives, have always been, they were the people that sort of pushed for war. They're basically hawkish. Their view is that enterprise, and particularly not exclusively oil enterprise, builds democracy in the rest of the world and is essential for our economy. And even though they're for various social programs, and they were originally liberals, they have a more hawkish view than, I guess, most of the less hawkish Democrats. Whether or not that has any effect on whether or not we'll go to a war again in this region, I don't know. I mean, I don't think we're going to get involved in Syria for a number of reasons, not with boots on the ground. But I think the temptation to end up in oil, and especially if these pipelines are threatened, which they could be, the Kurds are really active in that area. There's, I think it's called the Kurdistan Regional Authority or something. They're having arguments with Baghdad, and Baghdad wants the wells to go through, and they kind of really, they don't want a U.S. presence, particularly. At this point, they haven't really, I don't know, there's not war going on or serious internal strife, but it's a possibility that, particularly the Exxon well, particularly because its location near the Kurds, who don't really accept much of what Baghdad rules anyway, that could be a problem. So that's something to look for in the future. But we'll see, and we'll see also if these oils really return. Probably the biggest problem now is that there's still internal strife and warring between, not really quite outright warring, but there's a potential for it there. The other thing that I thought was interesting, let me see, I didn't finish this entirely. There's also a local company, which I think is really interesting, called Occidental Petroleum, which has a site, couple of wells, or really a couple of areas in the country that they're going to be doing drilling. And it's called Oxy here. There was an Oxy office like right near the Galleria. And they supply supposedly a lot of the gasoline locally in Texas. Of course, that a lot of these companies have headquarters in Houston as well as the oil companies themselves, or at least sites. So this could be a real boon for the Texas economy. Let's see. I think that what I was going to say about Syria, which is kind of interesting, is that I guess there are people that believe that under the Reagan administration, and I think Cheney met with Saddam about the time, near the time of the chemical attacks on, what's the name of the place that the Kurds were killed? Hajaba? Anybody know? Okay, when Saddam first used chemical weapons against the Kurds. Anyway, there's the possibility, the U.S. knew that, but in terms of chemical weapons, the U.S., I think, first started producing chemical weapons around World War I. I don't think they were used, might be some sources that say they were, but they were stockpiled as part of the Cold War. About every type of chemical weapon they could obtain once they were obtained by Russia, we obtained them. We've been, just like our nuclear weapons, we've been disarming them and destroying them, but we've been doing it over years. And we may still have some chemical weapons that remain because we're still making deals. George W. made a lot of deals with Russia to reduce our chemical stockpiles. If we have any left, it's not a lot, but we've always had them. We've had accidents with them before. We had accidents with them in World War II where there was a freighter that had chemical weapons that were bombed by German or Japanese planes. Maybe I don't know if it's in the Pacific or really where it was, but that's one of the reasons we're disarming them. And another reason is nuclear weapons are more intelligent, more effective, and at least storage is a little safer. But I guess my point there is, in terms of crossing a line, I mean, I think we could wait a while before we went into Syria, unless, depends on the range of their chemical weapons or who they're going to use them against. I thought it was also very interesting that when Israel attacked Syria, there were actually lots of statistics on the casualties. When the U.S. had casualties daily, in the regions of Iraq, you didn't see a lot of printing on Iraqi casualties or Iraqi civilian dead. But there are, there's the UN, there's the Iraqi Body Count Project, and there's a couple other organizations. Now, the Iraqi Body Count Project, which is a really interesting one, they have memorials for both sides at the University of Oregon. I think that's where it is. So, do I have anything else to say? No, I think in conclusion, I'm just going to say that I think there is an ongoing U.S. policy that could lead us into war over oil in any of this region. And I think there's a large American misperception, or at least not a strong awareness, either of the casualties that were caused by the Iraqi war, or probably the reasons for the war as associated with casualties. What am I talking about? What's my conclusion? Oh, there's just one other thing. The four organizations that are funded largely by oil dollars and are mostly consist of neoconservatives, they're still active. They're still in a lot of administrations, and a lot of them are kind of, once they were apologists for Iraq, now they're kind of involved in a lot of other issues, including spinning information about Benghazi. A lot of those people were, pro-Iraqi war, and they're neoconservatives as well. Like there's Norman Podhoretz and his son John Podhoretz, who I've seen on TV, talking about Benghazi. I don't want to sound too biased politically. My take on Benghazi really is that there were 9 attacks on embassies during Bush's administration. There were things done by the Secretary of State, if you talk about the Iraqi war, that were really questionable in terms of the use of torture, that were spearheaded by the Secretary of State and her office. Didn't really stick much in terms of hurting they did stick in terms of hurting the Bush administration, but not in terms of, I think, hurting the Republican Party. And I think there's a very strong spin. This is kind of not difficult to come up with, that Benghazi is really trying to hurt support for the Democrats at the time, that their approval is pretty high. I think Bush was more slammed on his approval ratings, both positively and negatively, because of the war in Iraq than any other subject. That's not surprising. Wars have that effect on a lot of candidates. Carter thinks that he lost his re-election because of Iraq. And that was, because of the Iranian hostage crisis. What I've read in some of these books, which is really interesting, is that Bush's approval ratings went from 50%, which was pretty good, to as high as 70% during the first days of the Iraqi war and the invasion in Afghanistan. Once we'd been in there that long, and Al-Qaeda started extending the war an additional 8 years, they started plummeting. When the economy started coming down, that also didn't help. But just on the basis of that alone, they plunged, back really significantly. But that 50 to 70% spike kind of helped in the midterm elections, and probably those that were most, that looked most happily on the Bush administration did it about at that point. Okay, Are there any questions, or, I don't know, I said too much, oh, what?
Question I had is, in your research, did you come across any information about the Pashtuns? They're an ethnic group that's split, their territory is totally split in half between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and this secure border, which is closed, and cut their whole civilization in half. Have you run across them?
No, do you know can you say anything more about them?
Well, I'd seen this in this was just one little angle in a film I'd seen years ago, but that might be something to do an internet search of and see what can come up with that. But what I do recall is that they've pretty much been cut totally in half, and the border seems totally arbitrary.
Well, this is a lot of people. Yes?
Yeah, you made a reference to OPEC.
Yeah.
They are still in existence, correct?
Right.
Okay. And OPEC is
It's a good
a
question.
grouping of multinationals, not necessarily countries, correct?
Multinational oil companies and, well, no, actually it's the oil producing countries, I thought. And the oil that they produce, but yeah, it's
So OPEC are not corporations or multinationals, they're countries?
yes. But I mean, they control oil in their countries, and that's how they.
Because I read somewhere that cartels are illegal. How does that play into OPEC?
Oh, into OPEC, or you mean into the U.S. and the Western multinationals?
Okay.
What your question is about OPEC?
Yeah.
I don't know that much about OPEC, really.
Okay. So if the oil was cut off to the United States,
Well, I'm not saying, I'm not talking about, I mean, the oil is not going to be cut off to the United States. There's too many multinationals in too many different countries.
that's what I'm saying.
But I'm saying the ready flow of oil, I'm talking about in the future
Right.
also, and I'm talking about Western Europe, and that we supply oil to a lot of those countries, and it's really a matter of just cheaper oil, not so much a complete drop in the flow of oil, and what we'll be doing when and if we exhaust the oil in the United States and North America, and if that could happen, based on the possibility or maybe the probability that we're not going to cut down consumption.
Yeah.
I'm not a real oil executive.
So if the less oil that is distributed in the world, the more money the multinationals make, including OPEC.
That's, well, some look at it that way. I mean, they say that the Iranian oil crisis was about cutting flow to the United States, so the prices would go up. But that's not really the problem with that. Of course, is yeah, we don't want that, and but I don't know. I think there were periods of time when the U.S. oil companies like to cut off flow to increase prices. But this isn't really what this is about. This is about the potential that the flow could stop for a long enough period of time that there would be a serious rise in prices or a lack of supply, if our consumption continued. And of course, with the increased profits, it's getting more expensive to drill in a lot of countries. I mean, they're always interested in profits, but they're also in the U.S. They're not doing this for oil companies to make greater profits. They're doing it with the hope that there won't be an energy crisis in the future, or there at least will be a steady supply of oil. Basically, I mean, you've got an untapped potential. What's happening in the world now, and what we anticipate by 2020, 2030, is there are going to be a lot of depleted reserves, a lot of depleted countries with depleted oil. Saudi Arabia being possibly one of them, not significantly since they have such huge reserves, but certainly the United States, certainly possibly Canada, and it's more expensive to drill there. A lot of the oil in the United States is offshore, and you're I think digging into rock, and you're reprocessing it. You have to reliquefy it, or you have to drill directionally, which I'm not sure what that means, but the oil in, particularly in Iraq, it's so dense, it's so close to the surface that when they drill in, there's actually pressure coming forward. There's not really the need to break it up or reconstitute it or any of that. So, I mean, and despite that, I mean, oil is not a renewable resource. So I think what the U.S. needs to do, and I think what most of these books have said, is really seriously subsidize or do something. And I don't know if this is not an easy thing. I don't know if this can take place, but we need to seriously cut our consumption by using renewable sources. And I think it's more of a critical issue. And I think the fact of like the global warming, I think it's an inevitability.
So I know that OPEC is not your specialty, but
Yeah.
what is the relationship between the multinationals and OPEC?
The U.S. multinationals or the multinationals in? Okay, I think what I was trying to say is that if we have larger control and more U.S. and Western-based multinationals supplying to the West, rather than more control by the oil-producing companies, and Saudi Arabia became one of those. The truth is, from what I've read, and it's not a lot, but the 1973 or 4 energy crisis caused by OPEC, that was a short-term thing. I don't know if there's really the possibility of that happening again, but there are other things that could cause a shortage or could cause a stoppage. We feel that, particularly for our allies, that even a small shortage or small depletion in the world's supplies for a period of time, which is what happened during the war and which happened, in our view, under nationalization in Iraq, could hurt the economy. And then did hurt the economy even when the Iraqi supply went down a little bit. And probably hurt probably hurts Europe more, although I don't know where they get the bulk of their oil. It's surprising where countries get oil. I mean, Israel gets oil from Russia. It's just kind of strange since they were not military allies. Anyway, anybody else? Yep.
Here on the synopsis, if you're interested in understanding why Islamic terrorists kill America.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of controversial. I probably should have said that. Oh, what?
When are you going to talk about that?
Oh, I talked about that a little bit. I think it. Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. If you want to talk about it, what Dzhokhar Zarnev said. The one thing, and another thing is, nobody really asked him why he did it. It was never in the papers. Well, why'd you do this? How do you feel about the U.S. and so forth? He was portrayed, understandably, I guess, but not in terms of. It's not really. Maybe someday he'll talk to a therapist, and we'll get if he heals quick enough. But he said that he was angry about civilian casualties in the U.S. war with Iran and Iraq. Now, if the U.S., in my opinion, doesn't have a perception of the amount of the death toll, or the fact that a lot of this is about oil consumption. That's the perception of a lot of Islams. Now, in terms of how extreme they're going to be and how they respond to that, there's the feeling of frustration by these groups that we're there for financial gain, we're there to destroy Islam. I mean, all of these groups, we have suppressed, I think because of the number that have died, the number that were in prison, and the number of civilians that die. That's not you don't have to be completely insane to be a Muslim to feel that way. Now, if there's a spillover, and there were theories that, well, why do we have this huge insurgency by Al-Qaeda when we didn't anticipate any of this? I mean, how are they getting these people to come in and kill us all, and kill themselves? Well, the conversion, I think, of Islam from, they all want, I mean, most Muslims want Islam, an Islamic state, and they want Islamic law. At the very least, they don't want Western rule, and they don't want Christianity anywhere. So you can go from that to, how you go from there to violence. If you only base it on the number of Islamic men, women, and children, about 7% children, that have died in the last 30 years, I think going from that point to rage, it's not a huge step. Think how you responded. This is kind of what I was going to get to, but think how you responded when there were 3 American civilians killed and 200 wounded. Now think about at least 10 years in 2 countries of continuous bombing, either by an insurgency or by U.S. bombs daily, where you get hundreds die per month. People that are, your family, people that you know closely, they did a poll. They found that 20% of Iraqis that had people, family die, or people they knew directly during the war. Now, we don't have people that we knew that died in Boston. We react if they reacted a tenth in the way that we react from that incident, and we marginalized him as completely insane villain, terrorist. But a lot of Iraqis feel that we're terrorists because of the death toll, and because they feel that we're there basically to extract their wealth and their country's wealth. Now, do you see my point a little bit? I don't know. Yeah.
You're saying, in a nutshell,
Yeah.
is that they're angry because we killed them and steal their resources. Is it possible that the U.S.
And that we suppress Islam as
set off
well.
all the conditions and all the intelligence, all to infiltrate and to radicalize the Muslims because the Soviet Union was no longer going to be a threat, and the U.S. military and the whole system how it's set up requires an external threat, so we just kind of shifted it over to the Muslim nations?
No, I think we're pretty good at pissing people off. I mean, we've had insurrections in a lot of the countries that we've, the insurrection in Vietnam, we didn't expect that war to go as long. We didn't even expect the Iranian hostage crisis. We didn't expect, the Russians didn't expect the 10-year war. The U.S. didn't expect more than a 2-year war with Iraq, and we did vanquish Saddam's military in 2 years. No, I think we miscalculated, misappropriated. I don't think we want Al Qaeda. I mean,
We're still there because that's with the intention. That was our aim, was to go there and stay there.
No,
also in Afghanistan, we're not leaving there either.
No, I actually don't think we wanted to be there. I think we wanted to get out quick. I think we wanted to vanquish the Taliban as quickly as we could. We don't like the loss of U.S. soldiers at all. The public really doesn't like it. I think, I think if you interview these people, the neoconservatives, and that's what they tell you. And the only other thing I want to say, now I'm taking too much time, is that there are 4 or 5 think tanks that mostly put out fairly conservative views, and most of them are apologists. They're mostly people that really write stuff that kind of spins pro for Iraq. And some of these groups, and you read them in the Dallas Morning News a lot, and if you can identify them, it's kind of fun, because then you go, wait a minute, okay, this sounds a little weird, and then it gives a credit. And I've seen a lot of these. I frequently see the American Enterprise Institute. I see that in USA Today, and that's the largest distributor newspaper in America, and they're owned by the Gannett Corporation, which has always been fairly conservative. I've seen them quoting American Enterprise Institute in one article. I think they were saying something about Hamid Karzai, who was constantly crying, once a year about civilian losses. And America, marginalized everything he said. It's like, They interviewed in 2006 some Americans that said, how many civilians, what do you think the loss of life is in Iraq right now? And a lot of them said, I don't know, I think they were talking about civilians, said maybe 10, 15,000, at a point where it was about 100,000. They said if the war goes on much longer, are you willing to do that if it costs a lot more deaths of Iraqis, and particularly civilians? And most of them said, yeah, that's okay. So, I mean, the American feeling about this. I think also what I wanted to say is if you pay taxes, you support the wars. If you vote, I mean, you don't really have a choice. I think if you take 1/10 of your taxes over a 10-year period, you average it, then you take 1/10 of that. I don't know what percentage of it specifically goes to combat, but we don't really have a choice as citizens. What was interesting, though, and I think what's significant, though, is that how democratic is our country when, I think one of the questions there is, how much did Bush lose the popular vote by? And I don't want to bash on Bush, but it was about 500,000 votes. That seems pretty significant to me. And then going in and basically having the power. Now, in the first war with George Herbert Walker, it was a close vote. It wasn't that close at all with W. They won. I mean, the majority of people at the time supported the war. All the senators that say they didn't, except for a few, probably did. I think Hillary was pretty much either convinced, but she just put more weight on George W. and said, you know, you better not screw this up, or you better be right. But that also was, I think, so what I was going to say, that I've seen the J. Pew, what is it called? Oh, the Pew Foundation, which is J. Howard Pew, who owned Sun Oil originally, years ago. And everything that comes out of that is pretty much, it's very subtle, though. You know, they're not going to come out and say crazy stuff, but I think what they just said something that's sort of marginalized. And they were quoting Fred Kagan. Fred Kagan is another neoconservative who works for American Enterprise Institute. So if you see that group, or also, let's see, I think it's called Project for New American Century. And then a recent one you've seen in the news, which is really conservative, is the Heritage Foundation. So you'll see them quoted here and there, and you'll see websites, and you won't see anything on there that this is a conservative view. And they've already spun the information before it even goes to the paper. I read another article, interesting, in the Dallas Morning News about gun control, and they're always on the front page. And then if you read in the back page, you get, and the headlines always pretty much promote one point of view. Now the reason is not that they want to brainwash you, really. The reason is they assume that the readership here wants to read stuff like that. And what Karl Rove said is everyone already has their mind made up in terms of who they're going to vote for anyway. So what you do is if you cling to some information that people are going to accept, it doesn't have to be terribly true, it doesn't have to be really accurate, it just has to be stuff that they'll remember quickly and it's visceral, and it'll make them vote. It's got to be something serious like, oh, I don't know, and Roe is pretty much responsible for most of the Republicans currently operating. When he won the Clements campaign against, I don't know, Clements ran against Mark White. Is he, did he, there was a lot of improprieties about that campaign, and I think he's done so many things it's hard to find them, but I think what you find that he did do, he counseled the Bush administration really carefully on knowing pretty much every step and everything they said that would register positively in the minds of voters. So that's just my opinion. Yeah.
What is the point of this talk? In other words,
none at all.
What should we do?
Good point.
Or learn?
Okay, that's a good question.
One point.
I think there's a lot of things really I'd like you to take away from this.
What should we do? I mean, like.
Well, I mean, I think that the authors of these books said that we need to conserve energy badly. That if we get into any more wars in the Middle East, that we should be really careful and cautious, and be aware that they may reflect U.S. energy policy, even if they're countries like Syria, because the government's not going to say, "Hey, this is about oil." They don't say that.
So I should flush my toilet only every 3 times.
Well, not if I'm visiting, but.
All right, make an exception.
What is the other thing? I don't know. And I think it's interesting when you're, what is it? When you're reading an article and you see a foundation, and you'll see it a lot, especially in the Dallas Morning News, and you see a foundation, it's fun to research it to see what they stand for. Yes?
Has anybody ever figured out exactly how much Cheney's company Halliburton made off the shock and awe?
That, you know what? Okay.
How much the military-industrial complex in general made off the shock and awe war in Iraq? How much also they have made in profit from the war in Afghanistan? How many of those were cronies of George Bush and senior George Bush and cronies of the Skull and Bones and so on and so forth, ad infinitum?
I think that no, I don't know that, but I'm also really curious what the war cost totally in aggregates. I mean, it's in the trillions, but I think that it was like 70 million a day, something like that. Does that sound close? Okay, the only
Cheney's company, Halliburton, made ludicrously, ridiculously
okay. I'll give you a figure.
Profits. Just that one company alone, that was part of the inner circle. That are run by the secret society.
I don't know. I know that if you look at Halliburton, I've looked at the Halliburton website since 2006, and their profitability is straight up. I mean, it's not straight up, but it's up every year significantly. It's like, look at it. It's like a ladder. I mean, it's a cliff going up. But the only thing I know is that they said that tens of billions of dollars reflect the profits that the four combined oil equipment suppliers will make. So, I mean, I think maybe they'll make 10 billion or 15 billion in a short time, maybe the next 3 to 4 or 5 years. Halliburton, just in Iraq, and then it's a guess, I don't know. But then they were making money way before this. I'm just talking about between now and the next 3 to 4 years. So I'd say they'll make at least I'm just guessing, maybe 3 to 4 billion a year.
What do you think the total of profit is in the military-industrial complex in general, including Chinese company Halliburton altogether? Ransom total between the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan over the last 10 years or so. We're talking $1 trillion in profit or what?
Well, if you look at Exxon, their profits in the last, I'm only going to tell you what I know, and it's not that much, but Exxon's making about 40 billion a year. Now, if you look at next year, and I don't see how they can top that, that makes them the richest company. They way outpace all of the car companies, who really haven't had that many good years in the history of the world, just Exxon Mobil. And we're talking about Exxon Mobil, British Petroleum, really also maybe Occidental Oil. I don't know, it's not going to be that profitable for them.
Exxon, they're going to make money whether there's a war or not. I'm talking about the companies in the military-industrial complex, including Halliburton, which is part of that old group.
I don't know. I mean,
because they go in and rebuild after everybody else has destroyed.
They're all not doing that, to be honest.
system.
I mean, their stock isn't necessarily taking off, but their profitability is, that's all I know. Well, not all of their stocks. Like Schlumberger, which I have. I haven't seen it. It's done well. Oh, Exxon, yes. Right.
What they're doing is putting money away in funds rather than giving it to the stockholders. And that's one of the major complaints. I wanted to make a point here. We're talking about all this. We have to consider, when should a country go to war? We assume this countries go to war only on one basis up until now. The basis was, can we militarily have such superiority that we're going to win the war? That's the wrong way of thinking. You've got to think of, you don't win the war and then lose the peace. Some general back in Roman times found that out. But what you've got to do is think of it, we win the war, we have to win the peace. Win the peace is we got to economically make the country feel that we're defeated, that we're going to make them better off. And secondly, we are not going to alter their religious beliefs. That's why, since we lost in Vietnam, we lost in Somalia, we lost in Iraq, and we lost in Afghanistan. You don't agree with this, but it's true that we've lost all those wars. We should stay out of the Middle East. If we do, we reduce Al-Qaeda and the other groups' influence, because then they don't even fight among themselves and won't fight against us.
Yeah, I thought of that. Just if we hadn't gone in at all.
Yeah. That's the way we should start thinking about things, and the direction of our policy should be stuff. I know you feel sorry for all the Syrians that are being killed because of the gas and soda. But we can't settle it. There's no positive outlet to that war. You know, there's no, the parties that win are going to lose. Let's go back. When was the last time that Afghanistan was occupied, completely occupied? You know when it was? It was under Alexander the Great. Now, the Romans tried to do it, unsuccessful. We try to do it, unsuccessful. The British try to do it all during the 19th century, unsuccessful. Russians try to do it, unsuccessful. Why don't we learn lessons? God sake. History teaches us that we cannot conquer the world. We've got to let countries do their own thinking, their own way. Yes, the world is safe for democracy, we all built that. It's not true, though. Because that's naive thinking.
Any rebuttals, right?
I had one question, but I don't need to speak up close to it. Putting all wars except Afghanistan and Iraq.
You want to speak or do you want to?
I haven't.
What's your question? Okay.
That's the question.
Okay.
During all wars we've been involved in, except the recent wars, during the time of war, we've had inflation and almost full employment. What happened during Iraq and Afghanistan? We have high unemployment and low inflation.
We have high unemployment and low inflation? Yeah, we should have what? High employment and, because we have, well, I mean,
Employment increases, okay?
right.
But there's a change though. We are going from an industrial age to a post-industrial age. And with that change, there has to be a lot of unemployment. Look, how many Smiths are left in the world? None. They almost died here taking care of the horses and putting the shoes on in the pre-industrial age. All of them had to change over with the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was not something that happened in a 5 or 10 year period. It was prolonged, you know? But this post-industrial computer society, whatever you want to call it, is a quick thing. And that's what's causing the tremendous dislocation of our employment because of that. And it's not just here in the United States, it's worldwide. You know, Arab Springs is due to, they don't realize it yet. They got rid of the bad rulers and some of them, but it hasn't changed anything. The Tunisian people are still really unhappy. The Egyptian people are still unhappy. No matter what they have, they'll be unhappy because they are unemployed. When you get employment rates of young people, especially young people who will revolt, young 25% unemployment, you're in trouble. You got to do something about it. And the thing that I really worry about, this is a perfect setup for another Hitler. Hitler came into power because of won the Treaty of Versailles, which caused a tremendous amount of reparations being paid by Germany to France. The way they did it, it caused such inflation that I collected stamps. So here's these 1 cent, 2 cent, 5 cent, 6 cent, 10, thousands, millions, so on. People in middle class, their savings were wiped out by inflation. Then comes 29, then you have the reverse happen. And here's all these unemployed people. And Hitler said, I'm going to put you back to work. I'm going to put you back to work. And he did put him back to work, but what the way he did it. This is what I really worry about, because this is a perfect setup.
Do you want to do a rebuttal? Okay. Thank you.
Hey, David. I've got a question. Why are we so short-sighted as far as history in this country?
Oh, that's really what I'm getting at, yeah.
It was at the turn of the century that Iraq and the Middle East that was controlled by Great Britain, it nearly bankrupted them. They could not control that region. And then what do? We don't learn a thing from it. We get into it, into that region. It's very unstable. How we thought we were going to control Iraq with 3 ethnic groups that are at each other's throats.
There's more than that, but yeah.
Well, those are the major.
Yeah, we can't. Yeah.
We keep doing this, even in Vietnam. When the French were defeated in Dien Bien Phu.
Yeah, I thought about that too.
What do? We go with
The same thing.
We do
Well,
the
I'm
same
even
thing.
comparing like the Afghani war, which was failure in terms of the number of years they were there, and it completely bankrupt the Soviet Union practically. And then we get into a war, and at least as far as how long we fight, it's the biggest failure of that war was we had it won in 2 years. We really did. And then we had to fight 8 more years, and it's still not stable. So, I mean, none of those, except for Saudi Arabia, I mean, we haven't really had any major uprisings or violence. Maybe because we got in so early. I don't know. I mean, that country never really had big designs. Maybe we will in the future. But, I mean, we got into Saudi Arabia, like, before World War II. Great Britain was in that region. Great Britain was in Iran, and they'd been fighting. And Russia gave money to kind of, I think, repel the British. I don't know, but probably, I don't know. And the whole, the assassination of, what was his name again? Yeah, Mossadegh, Mohammed, was planned originally by the British. They needed oil worse than we did at the time, and they were already in the region, and they'd lost a lot of their empire. So they came to the U.S. and said, by the way, this guy's a communist. And we said, oh, well, yeah, okay. He wasn't really a communist. And a lot of the problems with that regime, the Shah, was they were killing communists left and right, and we trained their secret police, the Savak. And that's one of the reasons they hate, they hate the regime, in addition to a bunch of other reasons. Anyway.
And you did consider one other factor. What is the biggest thing that Iran produces? Is poppy seed. And that whole business of the opium trade, we cannot control it. So it produces, it makes this problem even much more.
Yeah, Hamid Karzai's brother who's dead now, they think he was very heavily into the drug traffic of opium. They don't know what if he used it for financing rebels or what, or rather, that's another thing I didn't get into is that, Hamid Karzai was taking huge payments from the CIA, like bags of cash every month. You read that in the New York Times. And he'd also been taking it from Iran. I don't know what he did with that. I hope he didn't do much, but they stopped taking it from Iran. But he had no trouble admitting it because he thought, like, well, that's how we do business. And it's kind of how we do business here, except, you can't be public, and it has to come in. It has limited contributions. And you can give money to newspapers, and you can start what are classified as charitable organizations that actually turn out, I don't know, the control, really have kind of influence on the media, let's say. All right. Oh, stop.
Terrific job. Now it's your turn to talk. You got 5 minutes each for you want to comment up here on what the speaker had to say or anything you want to say. It's up to you. Who wants to be first? There has to be a first. Okay.
Hello, I'm Hank, and I usually find something to criticize. Okay. We talked about the wars and the motives and the pluses and minuses of our policies. I want to question who we is. I do. They kind of get us into this thing where we went to Vietnam, we went to Korea, and we ordered some turkey sandwiches. So anyway, what we have now, we have some rogue elements controlling foreign policy. What you don't understand, and this is kind of going to sound arrogant, but I don't know how else to put this, is that 911 was an inside job. 911 was an inside job. It was conducted by rogue elements of people that could at least control some parts of our air defense systems. And I wish somebody would, change my mind on this. That'd be really nice for my friends and family. But they haven't been able to, in fact, they haven't been able to even look at it. I came and presented over here, and nobody remembered anything. All I did was had slides from mainstream media, and movies of what was originally presented on 911 in Oklahoma City, and nobody remembered anything by the end of the session. Now, what's the point of this? I come here regularly. This is an exceptionally intelligent group of people, and yet there's some kind of psychological thing going on here. After 13 years, this is what I get into. This is the psychology of it, because evidence doesn't work. Nobody can look at this. Anybody who says 911 is not an inside job doesn't know anything. It's like you're not even in kindergarten, and I'm somewhere in high school. So I don't know what to tell you, except that I wish when you discuss these issues, you would look at why I would say that. Why would I say that? It's not because I'm crazy. It's easy to say, oh, he's a conspiracy theorist. What does that mean? That means that the mainstream media says anything that we don't push is conspiracy theory. It used to mean that there's more than one or two powerful people doing something in secret. But now it just means, don't believe it, just go on and on. Anyway, the question of we. There is a rogue element. It started, the seeds of it started after World War II. They made something called COG, continuity of government. When our enemies, which we made, China and Russia, were destroyed after World War II, we built them up. We gave them nuclear bombs. I say we, the military-industrial complex. This was so bad then that Eisenhower already knew it. He said, beware, beware, I'm losing control. Okay, so what happens during this time when it becomes feasible? I guess it's really true, who knows, that our entire nation, our way of life could be decapitated by the communists, the boogeyman, whatever. They made something called COG, continuity of government. COG is the secret government. It's not elected, and it was originally put in there to have an American force continue our way of life, our Constitution, even if a nuclear bomb landed on Washington on the day when all of Congress and the Vice President and the President were there would still be an American in charge somewhere, the continuity of government. Well, that has grown and grown and grown. It's got what's called black money. Look up Rumsfeld on the day before 911, not 911. Look up 910, 910-01, Rumsfeld talking. There's billions and trillions of dollars. It has nothing to do with Congress, has nothing to do with us, nothing to do with we. That element has gotten so strong. Now, the same thing, Oklahoma City, I found out afterwards, was an inside job. What does that mean? Does it mean the whole government is corrupt? No. It means there's some people so ruthless that have gotten hold of some pressure points. They have actually cowed down our police in Oklahoma City, cowed down our firemen in New York City. They know. Now, the congressmen, what I found out, the congressmen and the firemen knew before I did that 911 was an inside job. They cowed down. We're dealing with some ruthless things here. So you don't want to know it, but I recommend, if you care about any of this stuff, look at my videos. I'll watch them with you. I'll make sure you watch them. My friend here, Joe, he made 50,000 of them. I'm sure they went all in the trash. Because things are comfortable. You think it's going to stay like this? It's not. We have liars in charge of stuff. It's going to go bad. So I'm going off on a real tangent here, but I think it's more than blowback. Well, thank you.
Okay, who's next? There has to be a next. Ray. Ray Crea. You have the floor.
All right, the floor. Hank, we love you, man, but we don't want to hear about 9/11 ever again as long as we live. Thank you very much. You are alienating us, and we don't want to hear about it again.
Do you represent this crowd?
I don't want to hear about it. All right. Want to take a vote? No, we won't do that. A reason for going to war. Well, yes, there is a reason for going to war. Whenever our Pearl Harbor is bombed by the Japanese, we will go to war, and we will send our planes over there, and we will bomb the living daylights out of them and tear up their cities, and we will teach them a lesson. You do not attack the United States of America. And that will send a message to the rest of the world: you do not attack the United States of America. You will pay an awful price. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, good grief, where does it end? To that extent, I do agree with what Dean said. We can even ask, why on earth are we in Afghanistan now? They are tribal. They fight between themselves. It's not even like Iraq. I don't know why we cannot leave these countries alone. Why do we have to keep learning these lessons? I had this written down before you said one word, Dean. There is no end to the deaths and mayhem, not to mention even the cost. One reason we have gone to the Middle East, the biggest reason really perhaps of all, is oil. Well, why cannot we be energy independent? When we talked a few minutes ago about OPEC and the oil embargo in the 70s, we were asking the question then, let's be independent. We don't need this Middle Eastern oil. Why can a OPEC stop the whole United States of America? We had gas lines for months. How can this be? Who are we? We are beholden to a bunch of people on the other side of the world. Well, one reason we cannot seem to have energy independence is because we are allowing a handful of leftist environmentalists to keep the whole country from going forward. It is what is happening, my friends. Heard about the Keystone Pipeline? We can't get a Keystone Pipeline. And it isn't because of any environmental concerns, it's because of environmentalists. They won't let us do it. We are stuck, we are stymied, and we are paying attention to those people, and it's a handful of people who are doing this. The speaker mentioned a long line of corporations. Good grief. They're not hurting me. Look at all that list that's on the paper. They're not hurting me. They're not hurting you. They're not hurting this country. It's ridiculous. Halliburton, my friends, was not a problem then. I don't care if Halliburton makes jillions and billions of dollars. They didn't have anything to do with me or you or even this country. Let them make their money, and who cares? They were a diversion. We talked about Islamists. This last week, I heard a man who was an Islamist at one time, born in the Middle East. He has become a Christian 19 years ago. He said he was raised with the idea of jihad. Jihad is holy war. The whole idea he learned was you kill the infidel. If he doesn't convert to Islam, you kill him. That's what he learned. The idea is an Islamist state and even Sharia law. We've got the Muslim Brotherhood now in Egypt. Our administration is giving multi-millions of dollars to the Muslim Brotherhood. The whole country of Egypt isn't stable yet. The Muslim Brotherhood believes in jihad. They believe in killing infidels who are not Islamists. They believe in an Islamic state. They believe in Sharia law. You wait. It won't take very much to tip the balance, and the whole country of Egypt will have a Sharia law. Nigeria is having to fight off an Islamist radical group, Boko Haram, and if that Nigerian government and their military do not drive them out, they will take over the country. They drove them out of Mali. That's another African country. They finally have driven them out. We'll see what happens there. Not completely. Probably not. All right, last word. We, and that is the United States, because we are the United States, we must protect ourselves internally, within ourselves. We don't need to go there. We need to have the best intelligence gathering of any country. We need to know what those people who would wish to kill us are up to. We need our own Iron Dome, like a missile defense. That's what Israel has, an Iron Dome. A missile comes over, rockets are set off to explode that thing in the middle of the air rather than let the missile sent from who knows where to blow up their cities. We need to protect our borders and do it zealously. That said, if anyone threatens our ally Israel, they need to know that they too will pay an awful price. Thank you.
Okay, who's next? There has to be a next. Well, there always is. Oh, here. Are you next? I forgot your name. Bruce. Bruce is up. I know he has a name.
Right here.
Yeah, very good.
I just have to say something. I mean, we're talking about Islamists on a holy war. Has anybody forgotten about what we did in South America and Central America? What we did in this own country to the Native American people? Come on. Gee, I can't hear this anymore about we got to defend America and all this kind of crap. I mean, let's talk about people as human beings, not we're against somebody. I just get fed up with it. Yeah. I mean, we have a lot to answer for in this country as far as apologizing and restitution for all the bad we have done in the world. And the State Department, if you want to talk about the Middle East, do you think they didn't know about the history in Afghanistan and in Iraq? You know, with the Balfour. How about the Balfour Agreement and the Versailles Treaty when we divided up Iraq, when we knew it was going to put in one country the Sunni and the Shiites that hated each other. In 1920, a civil war against the British was started, which went on until World War II. Only World War II stopped it. You don't think the State Department doesn't know about that? You don't think they know about the history of Afghanistan that somebody else mentioned? Come on. I mean, that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Okay, who's next? You want to be next?
He said what I was going to say. I said it would be so great. Look what he did with my ancestors.
Yeah, you want to be next?
But he said that I forgot to mention about slavery. Yeah.
Jim, do you want to say something? No? Anybody, no next? I don't see any next. Well, that's not yet. We still got 15 minutes.
It's just in their train.
I know that, yeah. Maybe Dean wants to say something. You want to say something, Dean? I'll give you the here.
Well, I think you know my theme. I think I've expressed it over the last couple of months. I'm trying to start a society called the Guardians of the Middle Class. I don't know how to do it because I have no training in that at all. I'm a doctor, and I know nothing about economics. So you met my lawyer. How can we kind of do this? What I want to do is, if you look at the United States, we are going downhill. You know, do we have to go follow the pattern of Athens, of Rome, of France, of Victorian England? Do we have to follow that path to inevitable decline? No. At least that's my way. I'm a progressive. I'm not a determinist. That way. What do we have to do? We have to change the thinking about America. How do we do that? Especially when it we have had a change in our society. How do we do that? We gotta go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and thank him for something that at the time I was brought up directly opposite the points of view. But we got to the United States government has got to hire 7 million unemployed, well, healthy males and females. And we have to hire for the Federal Infrastructure Association. What do? We have to build the roads, the bridges, the highways, the bad schools, all that, and build a canal from the Mississippi River to the Brazos River to distribute water, because it's going to get worse in here in Texas. We have to hire some Israeli water engineers who will come over here. They've been very successful in having the desalinization plant. Build one here at Padre Island. Build another one right around Santa Barbara, California, because California is getting it now. Begin to realize it. Build up the infrastructure of the United States. And say to your, let's talk. Let you and your neighbors get together. How can we beautify our neighborhood? The big thing now in the United States is beautify America, make this the place that's really the place we want to live in. And we can do this if we just get together and say to ourselves, yes, we believe we have to be a major force in the world. We don't have to change politics about the country. Accept what we need to do for this country.
Well, is that it? Any more? I think that's it. Eddie, turn this off. Anyone else want to say anything? No, I guess I about covered. I'm the last one standing before our speaker gets back here and comments on the comment. First of all, I want to give our speaker a great hand for doing a great job tonight. It's great to get the thought-provoking action and things that get you thinking what it is we have to do. We have a big problem in our country. It's got 25 million people unemployed right now, and that's something we have to address. Gene Jacoby talked about building different, similar to the CCC projects and the WPA projects. The problem with those back then was that they finally ran out of money. In 1938, they shortened the workday and put everybody to work. That's how we got the 8-hour day. So maybe down the road, the time is to shorten the workday and put our nation back to work. If we get our nation back to work, we'll have more people working, paying taxes. We'll have less people not working, draining taxes. The government will get a twofold benefit of increased tax revenue without raising taxes, and they'll have less bills to pay for people that aren't working because they'll be working. That's my view anyway. I'd like to give our speaker, I think it's time we turn this back to the speaker so he gets comment on the comments.
Y'all can go home. I really don't know how to respond to what was said. If I can sum this up. Not much to sum up. What were my major points? I think that there was something to take. I don't know. Why don't y'all just go home? Any other questions? Yeah, it's late. Uh-oh. Oh, you're welcome. Okay. Oh, well, I don't know. I came up with this really because I was reacting to the bombings in Boston. I was thinking, well, really, what's the source of, if we're reacting this strongly to civilian deaths here, then why don't we have a sensitivity towards civilian deaths we're taking, and what are the differences in terms of the moral, the shifts from morality, if you're killing as a soldier, if you're killing as a, debate is a crazy person killing civilian life. So, I mean, there's civilian life taken in both instances. I guess that's all. I don't know. I mean, we're terrorism. They see us as terrorists, and actually, what am I thinking about? I don't know. The books I read were interesting. I don't have any conclusion. Thank you.
Well, we're done. We're here. We're good till 11 o'clock. So, speaker will be here. You can talk to him if you want, and we're finished when it comes to this mic. So, thank you.
This is William, your videographer from the KNOM website. Welcome to the College of Complexes. Let us know if you'd like to see some more of these nice videos.